Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back through the mists of time. As the modern world continues its hurried pace outside your window, I invite you to settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow the gentle currents of history to carry your thoughts away. Tonight, we'll explore the humble yet fascinating reality of medieval food, not as we might imagine it from fairy tales, but as it truly was for those who lived through those challenging times. This historical journey is designed to help you unwind, to create a peaceful space where curiosity can bloom while tension melts away. Let the rhythms of the past lull you toward restful contemplation, or perhaps even sleep, as we walk together through the kitchens and dining halls of long ago. I'm always delighted to know where in our global community you're joining from. Perhaps you're listening as evening shadows lengthen across your home, or maybe dawn is just breaking outside your window. Wherever and whenever you found this tale, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. It brings me such joy to see how these historical journeys connect us across distances. If these gentle explorations of the past bring you comfort or fascination, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next voyage through time. Each story is crafted with care, designed to transport you away from modern concerns into the rich tapestry of human experience. Now, let us leave behind our world of refrigerators and grocery stores, of abundant food and endless variety. Close your eyes if you wish, and travel with me to a small thatched cottage in medieval England, where the day begins long before the sun has considered rising. The bitter cold of January seeped through the cracks in the walls of the small cottage where Agnes and her family slept, huddled together on their straw mattress. Outside, the darkness was complete, yet Agnes stirred, knowing the day's work could not wait for daylight. She gently nudged her husband Thomas, who groaned softly before rising, his joints stiff from the cold and yesterday's labor in the Lord's fields. "The children can sleep a while longer," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air as she wrapped her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders. The embers in the central hearth had nearly died during the night, and Agnes knelt carefully, blowing gently until the faintest orange glow responded to her efforts. Adding precious kindling and then a small log from their dwindling winter store, she coaxed the fire back to life, its meager warmth a blessing in the pre-dawn chill. Thomas shuffled to the corner where their food stores were kept, assessing with a practiced eye how much longer their provisions might last. "We should use the barley today," he murmured, his weathered hands lifting a small sack. "The oats we'll save for when the weather turns worse." Agnes nodded in silent agreement, taking a careful measure of the grain, not too much, never too much. February and March would be the hardest months, when winter stores ran low, but spring's growth had yet to offer relief. She added water from the bucket they'd filled at the stream yesterday, setting the mixture to cook slowly over the fire in their family's one precious metal pot. The porridge would be thin today, as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow, but it would fill their bellies for a few hours at least. As the pale light of dawn finally crept through the cottage's single window, their children, Emma, just 10 years old, and little William, barely 6, stirred from sleep. "Is there honey today, Mother?" William asked hopefully, his small face brightening despite the cold. Agnes smiled gently, ruffling his hair. "Not today, my heart, but perhaps we'll find some wild berries when spring comes." She didn't mention that any berries they might find would likely go to the Lord's table as part of their tithe, not into their own porridge. The family gathered around the fire, each with a wooden bowl worn smooth from years of use. Agnes served the porridge carefully, ensuring each portion was equal, though she secretly took less for herself than she gave the others. Thomas noticed, as he always did, but said nothing. They ate in appreciative silence, savoring the warm food despite its blandness. No salt to season it, no honey to sweeten it. Such luxuries were rare indeed in a serf's home during winter. Later that morning, Agnes wrapped a portion of their precious grain in a cloth, preparing for the dreaded but necessary trip to the mill. "Take Emma with you," Thomas said as he prepared to leave for his work on the manor lands. "The miller cheats you less when the child is watching." Agnes nodded, knowing the truth of his words. The Lord's mill was the only place they were permitted to grind their grain, and the miller's toll was steep, sometimes a third of what they brought, though by right it should have been less. The walk to the mill was long and cold, with Emma trudging silently beside her mother along the frozen path. Other villagers were making the same journey, their faces etched with the same concern Agnes felt. How much would the miller take today? Would enough remain to feed their families? The sound of the great water wheel creaking in the partially frozen stream greeted them before the mill came into view, a sound that always tightened the knot in Agnes's stomach. "Ah, Agnes of Thornfield," the miller called out when they entered, his round face flushed from the relative warmth inside the mill. "Come to grind your winter stores, I see." His eyes assessed the small bundle she carried, and Agnes clutched it closer, as if that might somehow protect it from his greedy hands. "Just a small amount today, Master Miller," she said carefully, trying to keep the worry from her voice. Emma pressed against her side, wide-eyed and watchful. The miller took the cloth, opening it with practiced hands. "Not much here," he commented, though his tone suggested he'd take his usual share regardless. Agnes watched anxiously as he poured her grain into the hopper, the precious barley disappearing between the heavy millstones. The grinding was loud, drowning out any possibility of conversation, which perhaps was a blessing. When finished, the miller measured the flour with exaggerated care, taking his substantial portion before returning the remainder to Agnes. "There you are, woman. Fair as always." Fair was not the word Agnes would have chosen, looking at the significantly diminished amount returned to her. But she nodded respectfully. What choice did she have? And carefully wrapped the flour in her cloth. "Thank you, Master Miller," she said, the required words tasting bitter on her tongue. Emma remained silent until they were well away from the mill, then whispered, "He took too much, didn't he, Mother?" Agnes squeezed her daughter's hand. "That's the way of the world, child. The Lord's mill is the Lord's mill, and we must pay what is demanded." Back at the cottage, Agnes set about making their daily bread, mixing the freshly ground flour with water and a bit of the precious sourdough starter she kept carefully alive year-round. As she kneaded the dough with practiced hands, little William watched with interest. "Will there be bread tonight, Mother?" he asked hopefully. Agnes nodded, though she knew the loaf would be small. "Yes, my love. Not large, but enough." When Thomas returned from the fields that evening, exhausted and chilled to the bone, the small cottage was warmed by the fire and the humble aroma of baking bread. The family gathered once more, breaking the dark, dense loaf into 4 portions. William bit eagerly into his piece, then made a face, picking something from his mouth. "Stone," he said simply, showing the small pebble on his palm, before continuing to eat without complaint. Agnes sighed quietly. The millstones were old and wearing down, leaving grit in the flour that could break teeth if one wasn't careful. But complaining would change nothing, and the bread, despite its imperfections, was filling their empty stomachs. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same hunger, the same careful rationing of their stores. But tonight, they had bread, they had each other, and they had the warmth of their small fire against the winter cold. In the harsh reality of medieval life, that was as close to abundance as a family of serfs could hope to find. The contrast between Agnes's humble hearth and the great hall of Lord Radcliffe's castle could not have been more stark. While her family huddled around a meager fire, chewing cautiously to avoid the grit in their bread, just 3 miles away, servants bustled about, preparing for the evening's grand banquet. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes adorned stone walls, and enormous hearths roared with flame as kitchen boys turned spits laden with whole roasted swans, their feathers carefully replaced after cooking, to create the illusion of living birds adorning the table. "More saffron in the sauce," bellowed Master Henri, the French cook who had been imported at great expense specifically for Lord Radcliffe's reputation. "And mind the subtlety doesn't collapse. The sugar castle must stand until the final course." In the great hall, the lord and his guests were already seated at the high table, their fingers dipping into shared dishes of delicacies. Servants carried in a roasted peacock, its magnificent plumage reattached to the cooked bird, its beak gilded with real gold leaf. The diners gasped appreciatively, though few would actually enjoy the tough, stringy meat beneath the spectacular presentation. "Behold, my lords and ladies," announced the steward with practiced grandeur, "a peacock in its pride, symbol of nobility and immortality." The guests applauded as though witnessing a theatrical performance rather than the arrival of food. Indeed, the feast was as much spectacle as sustenance, a demonstration of Lord Radcliffe's wealth and power rather than a simple meal to satisfy hunger. While nobles dined on elaborate creations meant more for the eye than the palate, far to the east, Faraj al-Isfahani guided his caravan through the treacherous mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. For 2 years he had journeyed along the Silk Road, his camels laden with precious cargo, black peppercorns from the Malabar coast, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg and cloves from the distant Spice Islands. Each step had brought danger, bandits in Persia, blinding sandstorms in the desert, freezing nights in the mountains, and the constant fear of losing his valuable goods to thieves or the elements. "Water the camels sparingly," he instructed his men as they made camp for the night. "We are still 7 days from the next well." His face, once youthful and smooth, was now weathered by sun and wind, his beard streaked with premature gray from the hardships of the journey. By the time Faraj's caravan finally reached the gates of Castle Thornfield in northern England, more than half his men had turned back or perished. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, his once sturdy body gaunt from months of deprivation. Yet his eyes gleamed with triumph as the castle steward inspected the small sacks of peppercorns he had brought safely across continents. 20 pounds of black pepper, as contracted, Faraj said, his voice hoarse but proud. The steward nodded and summoned servants to bring forth payment, a small chest containing gold coins worth more than the annual income of 50 peasant families like Agnes's. "Lord Egerton will be pleased," the steward remarked. "His feast next month will be the envy of the county with such seasoning." Faraj said nothing, thinking of the 3 men who had died of fever in Damascus, to bring this luxury to English nobility, who would scarcely appreciate the human cost of their flavored sauces. Meanwhile, at Abbeyford Monastery, Brother Thomas stood in the kitchen, sweat beading on his tonsured head as he labored over a cauldron of fish stew. The Bishop of Winchester would arrive tomorrow with his entourage, and Abbot William had been explicit in his instructions. "We must show appropriate hospitality to His Excellency, spare no effort in the preparation." Brother Thomas stirred the rich broth, fragrant with imported saffron and wine, watching as kitchen helpers prepared pastry coffins filled with spiced venison from the monastery's extensive hunting grounds. "Brother, is this display not excessive?" whispered Brother Matthew, a young novice assisting with the preparations. "Our rule speaks of moderation and simplicity, yet we prepare food fit for kings, while peasants starve beyond our walls." Brother Thomas sighed, setting down his ladle for a moment. "The monastery must maintain its standing, Brother Matthew. The bishop brings donations and protection." He gestured toward the far corner of the kitchen, where several monks prepared the simple barley bread and bean pottage that would feed the majority of the brotherhood. Remember that while the abbot and his honored guests dine on delicacies, we ordinary brothers will eat our usual fare. The Church, like all of God's creation, has its natural hierarchy. He did not voice his own discomfort. How the elaborate feasts for visiting dignitaries seemed to mock their vows of poverty, or how the monastery storerooms bulged with provisions, while beggars gathered hopefully at the gates, receiving only the most meager of leftovers. Instead, he returned to his stirring, adding another pinch of precious saffron to the stew that he himself would never taste. As evening fell across the land, these separate worlds continued their parallel existence. Agnes's family chewing their gritty bread in their humble cottage, Lord Radcliffe's guests marveling at elaborate sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks they barely tasted, Faraj counting his hard-earned gold while nursing wounds from his perilous journey, and Brother Thomas preparing food he would never eat for men who had never known hunger. The great divide was not merely in the quality or quantity of food, but in the very meaning it held. Mere survival for some, a display of power for others, and for a few like Brother Thomas, a daily reminder of the contradictions between spiritual ideals and worldly realities. As autumn's golden light bathed the village of Thornfield, a different kind of anticipation filled the air, not the merriment of harvest festivals, but the grim necessity of what the villagers called the culling. The first frost had touched the morning grass, signaling that time of year when difficult decisions must be made about which animals could be fed through winter and which must be slaughtered. "Thomas," Agnes called to her husband as she peered into their nearly empty hay store, "we cannot possibly keep both goats through winter." Her voice carried the weight of calculation that medieval survival demanded. Each animal required feed they could scarcely spare, yet providing milk and meat that sustained their family through the darkest months. By mid-morning, the village common had transformed into an open-air butchery. Families brought forward the animals they could not sustain. Old laying hens past their prime, goats, sheep, and even beloved pigs that had been fattened on summer's bounty. "Stand back, children," Thomas instructed Emma and William as he led their older goat forward. "This is not a sight for young eyes." But Emma, now 12 winters old, shook her head. "I must learn, father," she insisted, her small face set with determination beyond her years. The girl understood what her parents knew too well, that sentimentality was a luxury they could not afford when winter's hunger loomed so near. The village butcher worked methodically, his movements efficient after decades of practice. Nothing would be wasted. Blood collected for puddings, intestines cleaned for sausage casings, even hooves and bones set aside for glue and tools. "Agnes, your salt is ready," called Widow Marjorie, who supervised the crucial preservation process. Salt, expensive and precious, had been hoarded by each family throughout the year for this very purpose. Agnes nodded gratefully, taking her small allotment and beginning the meticulous work of rubbing it into strips of meat. "Layer it well," advised Marjorie. "Remember how the Coopers lost half their stores last winter when the brine was too weak." In the smokehouse, a communal structure that now worked day and night, Thomas hung carefully prepared cuts from the rafters. The dense smoke from green applewood would slowly transform the raw flesh into food that could sustain them for months. "We must be vigilant with the fire," cautioned the village elder as he instructed younger men on maintaining the precise temperature. "Too hot and the fat renders out. Too cool and the meat spoils before it cures." This knowledge, passed down through generations, meant the difference between winter survival and starvation. Miles away at Castle Thornfield, Lord Radcliffe's steward oversaw a similar but vastly different operation. The venison must be properly aged, he instructed the kitchen staff, but not so long that his lordship detects any hint of decay. Unlike the villagers who preserved from necessity, the castle's stores were already abundant. Their concern was not survival, but maintaining the appearance of freshness in meat that had begun its inevitable decline. "Double the cloves and cinnamon in the sauce," the head cook ordered, "and ensure the wine is strongly spiced." These costly aromatics served a dual purpose, signaling the lord's wealth while disguising the slightly putrid taste that even nobility could not entirely avoid. In the merchant quarter of the nearby town, Giles the wool trader hosted a feast for potential business partners. His wife Martha, supervised as servants, brought out a roast that had been hanging perhaps a week too long. "The cumin and pepper will mask it," she whispered to her kitchen maid, adding a liberal sprinkle of the precious spices that cost her husband 3 bolts of fine cloth. When served, the foreign merchants complimented the robust flavor of the dish, unaware that what they tasted was partially the beginning stages of decomposition artfully disguised. This was the reality of medieval dining, even for the prosperous. Food preservation was an imperfect science, and the line between aged and spoiled remained perilously thin. As winter deepened into February, the carefully preserved stores began their inevitable decline. In Agnes's cottage, the family gathered around their evening meal, a thin stew of salt pork that had developed a strange sliminess despite their best preservation efforts. "Boil it longer," Thomas suggested, "and add the dried herbs." The mint and rosemary from their summer garden served less as flavoring and more as necessary medicine against the questionable meat. Emma stirred the pot dutifully, her face pinched with hunger that made even this dubious meal seem appealing. "We have enough barley for 3 more weeks if we stretch it carefully," Agnes calculated aloud, her eyes constantly assessing their dwindling supplies. By March, the true crisis began, the period known grimly as the hunger gap, when winter stores had dwindled, but spring's growth had not yet begun, descended upon the village like a physical presence. Agnes led her children into the forest edges and along hedgerows, searching desperately for the first edible growth. "See here," she demonstrated, pulling back dead leaves to reveal tender dandelion shoots. "And here," pointing to stinging nettles that required careful handling but provided precious nourishment. William, only 8 years old, returned triumphantly with a handful of early chickweed. "Well done," his mother praised, though the small greens would barely flavor their evening pottage. Throughout the village, the evidence of winter's toll was written on human bodies: hollowed cheeks, dull eyes, and the shuffling gait of those conserving precious energy. The elderly and very young suffered most visibly. Widow Marjorie had taken to her bed, too weak to rise after sharing her meager stores with her grandchildren. Even Thomas, normally robust from his work as a carpenter, had tightened his belt to the last notch, his frame now gaunt beneath his woolen tunic. "We will endure," he whispered to Agnes in the darkness of night, when the children could not hear the doubt in his voice. "The first greens are coming. We need only last another few weeks." In the monastery gardens, Brother Thomas knelt in prayer before rows of carefully tended herbs. The first shoots of green onions, sorrel, and precious medicinal plants appearing under his watchful care. The monks, with their walled gardens and careful planning, suffered less than the villagers, but still felt winter's bite. "We must increase our charitable distribution," he argued in the chapter meeting. "The village children grow too weak." The abbot nodded gravely, though they all knew their stores had limits. "Thin the porridge for our own brothers," he finally decided, "so we might provide more for those outside our walls." Even in their relative security, the annual hunger gap demanded sacrifice from all. As March gave way to April, Agnes stood at the edge of their small plot of land, her eyes fixed on the first tender shoots of peas and early greens emerging from the soil. The family had survived another winter, barely. William had fallen ill for 2 frightening weeks. his small body fighting both hunger and fever, until a broth of the first spring herbs had finally brought color back to his cheeks. Emma had grown taller but thinner, her body consuming itself when food could not be found. Yet they had endured, as medieval families had for centuries, through the careful preservation of autumn's bounty and the desperate foraging of early spring. Agnes knelt to touch the small green shoots, whispering a prayer of gratitude. The cycle would begin again, growing, harvesting, preserving, each season a battle against hunger that defined medieval existence far more profoundly than any castle or cathedral.